When the old Carter Apiary shut its doors after nearly 40 years, most people assumed another beekeeper would buy the equipment. The extractors were gone within days. The trucks disappeared before the end of the week. Even the honey tanks found new owners. But behind the empty honey house sat nearly 900 weathered bee boxes that nobody bothered to load. They were too old, too mismatched, and too worn to justify hauling across the state. Most people expected they'd eventually be burned. Then a 26-year-old man started showing up with a flatbed trailer. Every afternoon, he loaded another stack. Nobody understood why. At first, people assumed he planned to clean them up and start a honey operation of his own. It seemed like the only explanation. But as the weeks passed, that theory stopped making sense. He never bought packages of bees. He never ordered queens. He never cleared a field for rows of hives. Instead, he stacked the old boxes beneath a simple pole barn on his family's property, covered them with tarps, and went back for another load. By the end of the month, more than 200 abandoned bee boxes had disappeared from the old apiary, yet the young man still hadn't put a single colony inside one of them. The questions only grew louder. If he wasn't trying to produce honey, why was he collecting them? By the time the last usable equipment disappeared from Carter Apiary, most people had already convinced themselves they understood Ethan Harper's plan. Starting a small honey operation with second-hand equipment seemed like the only explanation that made sense. New hive equipment was expensive, and plenty of beginners had built respectable apiaries with whatever they could afford. Around the county, people stopped asking why Ethan kept hauling away abandoned bee boxes and started discussing how long it would take before he harvested his first crop of honey. The strange part was that nothing else happened. Spring arrived, suppliers began advertising packaged bees, and experienced beekeepers placed their annual orders as they always had, yet Ethan never appeared on anyone's customer list. Whenever neighbors asked when he planned to fill the hundreds of boxes stacked beneath his pole barn, he simply said he wasn't ready yet. At first, most people assumed the delay came down to money, but that explanation became less convincing with every passing week. If he wanted to start small, a few colonies would have been enough. Instead, the boxes remained empty while he spent his days restoring equipment that wasn't being used. Each morning, another stack of weathered boxes found its way onto his workbench. Rotten bottom boards were replaced, cracked corners were reinforced, and years of wax and dirt were carefully scraped away. Some days he finished only a handful before packing away his tools, a pace that made little sense to anyone watching. To most people, a bee box was simply a container. Ethan seemed to believe every one of them deserved far more attention than the bees that would eventually occupy it, and that only deepened the mystery surrounding his project. As summer approached, his routine changed again. Instead of searching for bees, he began searching for people. He spent his afternoons visiting retired commercial beekeepers whose experience stretched back to a time when operations like Carter Apiary had helped shape the county's agricultural economy. Rather than asking how to produce more honey or grow an apiary as quickly as possible, Ethan wanted to understand why small beekeepers had once thrived alongside large commercial operations and what had quietly changed over the years. Those weren't the questions most beginners asked, and the older beekeepers noticed it immediately. During one of those visits, Harold Bennett listened patiently before closing the notebook Ethan had been filling all afternoon. After a thoughtful silence, he smiled and remarked that Ethan was asking the same questions they had asked when the county was still growing. Before Ethan could respond, Harold looked across the fields and added that most people believed Carter Apiary had simply closed its doors, but almost nobody had stopped to ask what else had disappeared with it. That single remark stayed with Ethan long after he drove home, because, for the first time, he began to suspect the abandoned bee boxes had never been the real story. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories about ordinary people who quietly solve extraordinary problems, consider subscribing to The Last Acre. We share true-to-life rural stories where patience, hard work, and practical wisdom often accomplish what everyone else believes is impossible. And while you're here, let us know what country you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these rural stories travel and where our community is growing. Now, let's go back to Ethan and discover what those abandoned bee boxes were really leading him toward. Harold Bennett's words refused to leave Ethan's mind. Most people believe Carter Apiary had simply gone out of business, But Harold had spoken as though the county had lost something far more important than a place that produced honey. Ethan didn't know what he meant, but he decided the answer wouldn't be found in another bee box. It would be found in the people who had depended on the apiary for decades. As he continued restoring a small number of boxes, unexpected visitors began pulling into his driveway. The first was an older hobby beekeeper carrying 2 weathered hive bodies that had spent years behind his shed. He wasn't looking to buy anything. He simply wanted to know whether they were still worth repairing because, ever since Carter Apiary closed, there was no one nearby he trusted to ask. A few days later, a young couple hoping to start their first apiary arrived with a pickup bed full of mismatched equipment they had purchased at an estate sale. They admitted they weren't even sure which pieces could safely be used together. Before the week ended, a small orchard owner stopped by looking for someone who knew where he could find dependable hive equipment before the next pollination season. None of those visitors came for the same reason, yet Ethan noticed something they all had in common. Every conversation eventually drifted back to Carter Apiary. Some remembered buying equipment there. Others remembered getting advice whenever a colony failed or a queen disappeared. A few simply missed having someone local who could answer questions without trying to sell them something expensive. Each story sounded different, but every one ended at the same empty building where 900 abandoned bee boxes had once been left behind. The pattern became clearer with every passing week. A retired beekeeper spoke about how difficult it had become to find replacement parts on short notice. A father trying to teach his son beekeeping admitted he no longer knew who to ask when problems appeared inside a hive. Another beekeeper explained that, years earlier, Carter Apiary had quietly repaired damaged equipment during the busy season, often refusing payment until after the honey harvest. None of those favors had seemed remarkable at the time because they had always been available. It was only after the doors closed that people realized how often they had depended on them. One evening, Ethan spread his notebook across the workbench and began reading through page after page of conversations. Equipment, advice, repairs, replacement parts, introductions to experienced beekeepers, emergency help during swarm season. On their own, none of those notes explained much, but together they revealed something he hadn't seen before. Carter Apiary had never been just another honey business. Without intending to, it had become the quiet center of the county's beekeeping community, holding together dozens of small operations in ways most people had never noticed until it was gone. For the first time, Ethan looked past the stacks of restored bee boxes lining the walls of his workshop. The boxes were only the most visible thing the apiary had left behind. The harder question wasn't how to save old equipment anymore. It was whether one person could ever replace everything that had quietly disappeared with the closing of a single business. By the end of summer, Ethan had restored only a fraction of the bee boxes stacked beneath his pole barn, yet people continued finding their way to his workshop. Some arrived carrying damaged hive bodies they hoped could still be repaired. Others came with questions they hadn't been able to answer on their own. Ethan never claimed to be an expert, and he certainly never imagined people would begin relying on him. But months of listening to retired commercial beekeepers had taught him something many instruction books couldn't. Before long, neighbors stopped seeing him as the young man collecting abandoned bee boxes and started seeing him as someone willing to help. One afternoon, the young couple who had visited weeks earlier returned after ordering their first colony of bees. They spread their equipment across Ethan's workshop floor and admitted they weren't sure whether everything would work together. Some of the hive bodies were different depths. Several frames were badly warped, and one bottom board had begun to rot around the entrance. Ethan explained that healthy bees could overcome many challenges, but poor equipment often created problems that beginners blamed on the colony itself. A hive that didn't close properly invited moisture, weakened colonies during cold weather, and made inspections far more difficult than they needed to be. Rather than simply repairing another box, he carefully matched every usable piece until the entire hive worked as one complete system. When the couple drove away, they weren't carrying a pile of second-hand equipment anymore. They were carrying confidence that their first season would begin the right way. Several weeks passed before Ethan saw them again. This time they weren't looking for advice. They arrived carrying a small jar of honey from their first harvest and spoke with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Instead of asking whether they were doing things correctly, they talked about what they planned to improve next season. Watching them leave, Ethan realized the greatest value he had given them wasn't a restored hive or a few practical tips. It was the confidence to solve tomorrow's problems without depending on someone else. Not long afterward, another truck pulled into the driveway. A beekeeper from the neighboring county had been told Ethan might be able to restore several neglected hive boxes. A week later, another customer arrived after hearing about the young couple's successful first season. Then another followed for the same reason. None of them came because Ethan advertised his work. They came because someone they trusted had quietly told them there was a young man outside town who cared more about getting things right than getting them finished quickly. As those visits became more frequent, Ethan noticed something he hadn't expected. Very few people asked for the cheapest equipment, and almost nobody tried to bargain over the price. Instead, they wanted reassurance that every hive body matched correctly, every frame fit as it should, and every repair had been completed well enough to last through years of use. They weren't really buying old wooden boxes. They were buying confidence, and after Carter Apiary closed, confidence had quietly become one of the hardest things for a new beekeeper to find. By the time autumn settled over the county, the workshop looked very different from the day Ethan hauled home his first trailer of abandoned bee boxes. The stacks of forgotten equipment were slowly shrinking, while a notebook beside his workbench filled with names, phone numbers, and promised completion dates. Without ever setting out to build a business, he had become the person more and more beekeepers trusted when they wanted to start well, instead of simply start quickly. What Ethan still didn't know was whether one pair of hands could keep pace with a reputation that seemed to be spreading farther with every passing week. Spring arrived earlier than expected, and with it came visitors Ethan had never met. One Saturday morning, a dusty pickup truck pulled into the driveway after traveling nearly 3 hours from the neighboring county. The middle-aged beekeeper climbed out, stretched his back, and smiled when Ethan looked surprised by the distance. "I passed 2 suppliers on the way here," the man admitted. "A friend told me if you say a hive is ready, I won't have to wonder about it later. That's worth the drive." The word stayed with Ethan long after the truck disappeared down the road. More visitors followed over the next several weeks. Some came from nearby towns, others from counties beyond the places Ethan had ever expected to serve. They rarely talked about prices or discounts. Instead, nearly every conversation began the same way. "Someone told me to come see you." That simple sentence revealed something Ethan hadn't noticed before. People weren't making long trips because his bee boxes were rare. There were plenty of old hive boxes scattered across barns and sheds throughout the region. What had become rare was confidence. Beginners wanted to know their hive bodies matched correctly. Experienced beekeepers wanted equipment they wouldn't have to repair again before winter. After Carter Apiary closed, dependable guidance had quietly disappeared alongside the business itself, and word had spread that one young man was taking the time to restore both the equipment and the confidence that came with it. As the season grew busier, so did the pressure. Every morning brought another list of calls to return, another trailer waiting outside the workshop, and another promise to finish before swarming season reached its peak. One afternoon, a commercial grower offered Ethan twice his normal price if he would move several restored hives to the front of the waiting list. "It's only business," the man said. "Nobody else has to know." For a moment, the offer was difficult to ignore. The extra money would have covered months of expenses, and there were still hundreds of abandoned bee boxes waiting beneath the pole barn. But Ethan looked across the workshop at the notebook filled with names, many belonging to people who had trusted his word weeks earlier. If he accepted one shortcut, every promise behind those names would mean a little less. He quietly shook his head. "I'll get to yours," he said, "but I'll get there in the order I promised." The grower nodded, disappointed, and drove away. A few days later, another customer arrived after hearing what had happened. "My neighbor said you turned down extra money rather than move someone else's order," she said. "That's why I'm here." Ethan hadn't realized people were talking about that decision, but it reminded him that reputation wasn't built by the jobs he accepted. It was built by the ones he refused to compromise. By the end of summer, the workshop had become quieter than the notebook beside his bench suggested. The stacks of abandoned bee boxes continued shrinking, yet the waiting list kept growing. Names now filled page after page, with some customers willing to wait until the following spring rather than buy equipment they trusted less. Standing alone in the workshop one evening, Ethan ran his hand across the worn cover of the notebook and thought about Carter Apiary. Years earlier, one business had quietly carried the confidence of an entire community without most people ever noticing. Now those same people were looking to one young man to fill the space it had left behind. For the first time since hauling home those abandoned bee boxes, Ethan wondered whether the real challenge had never been restoring old equipment at all. It was carrying a responsibility that had once belonged to an entire apiary. Every abandoned bee box looked like a piece of forgotten equipment. What most people never saw was the opportunity hidden inside it. Sometimes the greatest opportunities don't come from finding something new. They come from recognizing the value in what everyone else has already given up on. What do you think was Ethan's greatest achievement? Was it building a waiting list business, preserving the knowledge of generations of beekeepers, or restoring confidence throughout his community? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on The Last Acre, where every acre has a story, every field holds a lesson, and sometimes the smallest discoveries leave the greatest legacy. Until next time, take care.